Hey friends, thanks for tuning in. This is yesterday's conversation with Joe Boyd, an incredible cat. He was the first to record Pink Floyd. He was the first to record Nick Drake. He made some amazing albums. I believe the great Kyra album from Toumani Diabate, and bringing him to the world. Wonderful recordings with REM. I mean, he's been there. He's been serving music. He was at Woodstock. He was at Newport when Dylan went electric. He was on tour with Muddy Waters in Europe. And he wrote this incredible book that will expand your world. I must have discovered 100 new artists, and many just blew my mind. Some that we didn't even get to talk about, like Ivo Papazov. Check him out, Ivo Papazov. Just incredible music. It's called "And the Roots of Rhythm Remain." The book is called "And the Roots of Rhythm Remain," and you'll just discover so much new music and how it came to be. It's incredible. So yeah, super excited for this. Here is my conversation with Joe Boyd. You're listening to NYC Radio Live. David Ellenbogen here. I'm thrilled to be with Joe Boyd, a man who's, well, been on the scene in just all the right places at all the right times, which is impressive on its own, but also has influenced music in really wonderful directions. If you had only given the world Toumani Diabate, that would have been enough. But it's been so much more. And this book, I've spent a lifetime trying to discover more about global music, and this just gave me a whole nother lifetime of discovery. I mean, countless incredible artists that I didn't know about, and a lot of mysteries were solved, new mysteries created, and so one overarching theme that I noticed or came to me is that it's almost like if the world was this global consciousness or something, music kind of tends to be this like synaptic connection, almost like trade routes, where suddenly something from one culture jumps to another, and everything is a little bit more interwoven than we had imagined. I'm curious, in the 17 years you spent working on this, what's the most like exciting kind of leap that came across to you?
Well, I mean, first of all, you've summed it up pretty well. That's what the book is about the fact that all music, all culture really is mongrel. There is no pure culture. And every form of music you find as a kind of musicians from one culture playing music from another culture and changing it as they do it, or listening to something from a neighboring culture, or after 1925 listening to a shellac 78 and going, wow, the Hawaiian guitar, let's try that. I mean, one of my favorite stories in the book, well, I guess there are two phases of this question. One is pre-1925 and one is post-1925, when technology changed the rules. But before that, in ancient times, one of my favorite stories that I discovered was the story of the Roma. I mean, I remember reading somewhere that they were from India, that their language was Sanskrit and stuff like that. But I discovered that there's actually a historical document which shows that the king of Persia wrote to his father-in-law, who was a Mughal ruler in Rajasthan, and said, "You got lots of musicians there. Send me a bunch of them." And so, evidently, according to this historic document in the 5th century AD, 10,000 members of this lowly caste of musicians and tinkers and people working with metal and horses and baskets and stuff like that, all moved from Rajasthan to Persia and didn't get along and just kept going. And they brought these fantastic instrumental techniques from northern India, first to Armenia, then to Turkey, then to Greece, then up into the Balkans. And everywhere they went, they learn, their job is to earn their living, earn money. And what's going to please the locals the most? To play their music. And they learned it and they played it better and they changed it in so doing. And that's how we got most of what we think of now as Balkan music. And eventually, the trail leads us to Django Reinhardt in Paris, and it leads to flamenco music in Spain. And everywhere you can feel rhythmically and harmonically and just the virtuosic way that they attack music is different from the way the local people did and more exciting. And it transformed, and classical composers from Haydn and Mozart to Liszt and Bartók were very influenced by the way these Roma played the instruments and played traditional music. And that's, I think a lot of people know how much Western music was shaped by colonialism and slavery, and the way that African music was sort of forcibly integrated with European music in the colonies of the Caribbean and Latin America and North America. But not that many people know about that equally forceful source of influence, the Roma. And I don't know what it means that the two primary inspirations for what we now consider modernity in music are groups of people that have been treated horribly by the West, that have been brutalized and killed and enslaved and jailed and beaten and they have lit us up in a way that no one else, that has transformed our society.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. That was one of the great revelations of your book. Was and also, you're not mentioning it, but there was now, but it's not just that some written documents or a legend that there is, but also linguistic roots, buying
DNA and everything.
So Esma Rejdapova went to India to celebrate, one of the big Roma musicians. So it's an accepted truth. And
now you have lots of, in Western festivals, you have Rajasthani jamming with Balkan musicians or jamming with flamenco musicians and demonstrating that connection.
Yeah, but that kind of leads to another theme, because you're saying that this mystery, like, how is it that people who are most brutalized are also bringing the most joy? And I found the kind of theme in the book was that music has to work. And I'm thinking, I think it was Charles Dickens. I meant to look it up, and I think there's a line they say, like, sad songs for the rich, happy songs for the poor. And, in different parts of your book, say in Russia, they are, music can be only this much ethnic, or now it's okay because now we accept this much ethnicity, or the Cuban music needs to work on the dance floor. There's so many different places that the music maybe. Yeah, go ahead.
There's lots of pressures on music all the time, and there is a general theme which I can't draw definitive conclusions about. But there's a lot of smoking guns that show that authenticity in music which really makes people's feet move and which really expresses the emotions and the backstories of a culture, are usually resisted and suppressed by religions and dictators. And I think, what we're experiencing right now is that, is foreshadowed by the way the Soviet Union hated anything rural and authentic. And there's some logic there, because Soviet communism was an urban workers' movement, and the rural peasantry wasn't interested. They had their own ways of collectivizing. They didn't need some guy with a theory to come from from Moscow and tell them how to collectivize and then take all the grain for the city. And so there was a war between the city and the country. And so music that was identified as rural and traditional and ancient, the Soviet Union was dedicated to making war against the past. And so anything that smacked of the past and history would be yeah, I mean, that was one of the keys to the book, in a way. One of the things that inspired the book was I was puzzled. It was a puzzle I wanted to solve. Was, why is the Bulgarian state ensemble so cool and so fun to listen to, and all the other state ensembles from Eastern Europe are so kitsch and uninteresting? And tracing that route back, and how the difference between Bulgaria and the other countries of the Soviet bloc, and why the Soviets were so hostile to authenticity. And of course, the churches have always been hostile to things that don't come from Rome, or don't come from the Protestant HQ, or from Mecca, that things which are traditional usually grow out of traditional beliefs, traditional drum patterns, which are associated with certain gods. People see it as it's a threat, because music takes people into a place that is inaccessible to propaganda, doctrine,
Yeah, I mean, I've always I had a working theory. Now I think it's too simplistic, but I always felt that African sacred music was kind of the secret fire behind all, say, rock and roll. Everything's hinting at Cuban music, the montuno, and there's like a play between that force that animates people, makes them lose themselves, and in extreme conditions even start speaking in tongues and rolling on the floor. And then what you pointed, out is these churches and so on that want to make sure that people are not having direct experiences, not direct divine experiences. And you traced it back, at least to, you said that it was the Visigoths that.
Well, that was one story which I discovered in Ned Sublet's book, Music of Cuba.
I read. That's a wonderful book. Yeah,
wonderful book.
Yeah.
It seems it was just one of those moments, and it was just a kind of one sentence, but it was just like, oh, that explains so much. That there was this chaos in the Iberian Peninsula, and the Pope wanted to clean it up and get it orderly. And so he invited the Visigoths, who were kind of at a loss. They were looking for a gig just north of the Pyrenees. The Pope said, go over the mountains and take over Spain, okay? And it wasn't quite that simple, of course. But one of the conditions was that they had to eliminate all sects and doctrines that were not orthodox from Roman Catholicism, and to eliminate pagan practice. And pagan practice meant drums. And so drums were swept away from the Iberian Peninsula in the 5th century. And they were really swept away from Europe, from Western Europe. There were no drums for 1,000 years. And, and so European music, in a way, evolved through harmony and melody and that kind of complexity, while in Cuba, the music was evolving, all these different African nations meeting. And the Cubans said, yeah, fine, build your drums, worship your gods, talk your language, whatever. Just, turn up for work in the cane fields at dawn. And so when Cuba became more urban after the Cuban Revolution, and so many people migrated to cities of Santiago and Havana and Matanzas, all these different African rhythms collided. And they, a lot of the music accommodated different rhythmic structures and built this urban music that was incredibly rhythmically rich and complex. And that sort of leaked over the border to New Orleans in various times, in various forms, ever following the Haitian Revolution across the 19th century and into the 20th century. Whereas in America, drums were no, 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 no. Protestant rule, the English said, no, you can't. They were paranoid about slaves starting a rebellion by signaling to each other with drums. And they wouldn't allow people to worship African gods, speak African language. It was Calvinism, Protestantism, very strict. The Catholics were like, sure, whatever, as long as you cross yourself and don't eat meat on Fridays and do what you're supposed to do in church, that's all we ask. Whereas the Protestants, like, you have to toe the line from the point of view of doctrine. And so, there's a huge difference between African-American music and Afro-Cuban music. And that difference you hear in Professor Longhair's Left Hand, and you hear it in Ragtime, and you hear it in dum, 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 in rock and roll. And that's that beat, dum, 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 is called the habanera. And it swept the world in the 19th century, swept the Spanish Empire, and is the root of the tango, and it's the root of so many things, magic beat.
Yeah. One of the two revelations from Ned's Cubanist music book that I'm thinking of right now. One was that the saraband, Bach's saraband, from the Congolese zarabunda. So there's a lightning connection.
Yeah.
The other is just what you're saying. I never realized that the entertainer, ragtime is just a clave beat.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that 2 plus 3 or 3 plus 2 everywhere, it infiltrates and it keeps coming back and back again. I love the fact that Burt Burns and George Goldner were working at the Brill Building in the 60s, and they used to always go around the corner and dance Latin at the Palladium at night, and you could feel it in all those records, those great records. Save the Last Dance for Me. It's got so much Cuban influence in it.
Yeah, 51st Street, 52nd Street, 53rd Street.
Yeah, exactly.
They're all really
Just
close.
1 second. Oh, okay. No, I'm not there yet. Sorry, I thought that. Yeah.
Well, anyway, yeah. I mean, when the original reason we reached out is that I was super moved. I attended your first book reading with David Byrne.
Okay.
And you told that story about the that we alluded to about the Roma music and its roots in Rajasthan. And I was hoping to play it during my I produce a 24-hour raga festival,
Right.
which is a fun. We kind of did it. It has a active audience. It's
Yeah, you do it. You must know Josh Jelly Shapiro.
Josh. No, I don't know him.
Oh, he does a podcast from that place in Brooklyn where the 24-hour raga.
Oh, okay, yeah, Pioneer Works, yeah.
Pioneer Works, yeah. He works for Pioneer Works, and he interviewed me. I did a thing at Pioneer Works.
I heard about that, yeah.
Yeah, and he told me that that's where the raga 24-hour raga thing happens, but it's broadcast by KCR, right?
Yeah, and I'm the KCR guy, yeah, too. Yeah, so
KCR, of course, I just have to say that it's a great honor to be on KCR. I worship at the shrine of Phil Shapp, of course, and my brother, where I'm visiting in Albuquerque, he's a Columbia graduate. So,
well, come by sometime. I'd love to show you the record collection.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and I mean, I used to go to Phil Shapp's shows in the morning. I'd host late at night, and one day Max Roach walked in. That was a life highlight. Just meeting him. Do you have to switch a record, or you?
Yeah, I do actually. Oh no, not yet. It's a little from this angle. It's a little hard to see. It looks like the needle is tracking to the middle, but not yet.
So yeah, it's all a segue to. I figured, the suggestion I think from Henry was that we kind of go deep in Indian music, which is probably a conversation you don't always have. All right, so yeah, start at the beginning. Here's one thing I discovered. Maybe it was on your radar already, but that Mughal, the word Mughal means Mongol in Persian.
Yeah.
And then Babar, I don't know if it's Babar or Barbar,
means barbarian.
Yeah, but he was, him and his son Akbar, they were all direct descendants of Genghis Khan.
Right.
So that was not on my that was not on my radar at all. So one frustration, because this festival has been going on for so long, I always felt like, man, does every presentation have to be the same? Like, I always felt that for Indian music, it can't always be this exact same presentation historically. I felt like my spider sense was that this was not always how it's been, and very much so. You kind of explain the roots of how that all came together. And I guess I could just hand it over to you, but it starts with, an 8-year-old runaway.
What, you mean Aladdin Khan?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Indian music for people in the West really began with the arrival of Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar Khan in America. And, I wasn't aware that there was any relationship between the two of them. One of them, they played different instruments. They seemed very different. And Ravi Shankar, they both had a huge influence on music starting in the 60s. But I never really knew the backstory of all of that. And there's a wonderful biography of Ravi that came out, I don't know, 5 years ago or something, which is fascinating. And there's also a guy, what's his name? There's a book called The Arrival of Indian Music in the West, I think, where he interviews Ali Akbar Khan and Ravi Shankar, but also Mickey Hart and Terry Riley and, Zakir Hussain and lots of different people. And it's great. It's full of great anecdote. And he interviews David Crosby and Roger McGuinn. And, so both the two books are a wonderful resource. And what emerges is that, and it's, in a way, it makes perfect sense that the person who really introduced Indian music to the West was not some rustic guy from a corner of the South Asian continent who suddenly arrived fully formed in the West. But Ravi Shankar had spent, when he was 12 or 13, he was sitting on Hollywood starlets' knees at parties in Beverly Hills, and he had performed all across America as a dancer in his brother's troupe. And his father had deserted his mother, married an English woman, and presented Indian music pageants in London in the 1920s and even earlier. And so there's a whole history in Ravi's background of sophisticated international awareness. And the big moment came when he and his brother Uday, who was like 20 years older than him, he was the head of this troupe, and the Ravi, age 12 or 13, they'd come back to India from their first tour, and they were in Calcutta, and they went to a recital by Aladdin Khan, and they were both completely blown away. They just thought this guy was incredible. And eventually, Aladdin Khan toured with the troupe to Europe. And eventually he convinced Ravi to give it all up and come and study with him in rural Bengal and get up every day at 4 o'clock in the morning and play and chase the scorpions and the cockroaches out of his room, when he had been living in luxurious suites. But Aladdin Khan turns out to have been this remarkable character who ran away from home, as you said, 8 years old, slept on the streets, begged and prodded and cajoled into getting a guru to teach him music, which was vocal initially. And he studied with this guru from age 12 to 16 or something. And all that time he'd lived on the streets, he grew to love folk music of Indian ordinary people. Because classical music, what we think of as Indian music, was very elevated and isolated. It took place in grand houses and palaces, and the elite would sit and listen to these 8-hour recitals. And he loved the traditional music and the drums and the folk instruments. And after his guru died when he was 16, he went to work for a dance band. He learned how to play Western piano. And then he found a Maharaja who would support him, and he started a gharana, and he became this amazing character that could remember a raga the first time he heard it. And a raga, which is, again, something I never knew until I did the research, every raga has a different scale. Raga is a scale, basically. And many of the notes of a raga scale, you can't, if you start the raga scale on D on a piano, it will hit notes that aren't on the piano, that are in between notes. It's not a tempered scale. It's an absolute scale. And it goes up one way and comes down another. There's always one note different between the escalating scale and the descending scale. And anyway, this was known, of course, by Ravi, but he and Aladdin Khan, he studied there for 7 years, and his co-student was Aladdin Khan's son, Ali Akbar Khan. So they grew up together. They were pals. And he ended up rather mistakenly marrying Ali Akbar Khan's sister, which didn't work out very well. But what he and Aladdin Khan would do, and Ali Akbar Khan, they would sit around at night, and Aladdin Khan had all these instruments from all over India, and he knew all the rhythms from South India. And Ravi was a great dancer, and he would dance with the bells, on his feet or just stomping on the floor. and they would play with rhythm. And rhythm became such a huge part of what Ravi evolved into as a sitar virtuoso. It was very different than the way other sitar virtuosos performed. And Aladdin Khan's influence, he was very, he'd seen the West, he'd been there, and Ravi had. They both, there was a subtext to all of this, like, how do we sell all this stuff to the West? How can we excite people outside just the elite of the Indian subcontinent? And it's a fantastic journey and an incredible achievement. And this sort of chance meeting between this brilliant boy and this fantastic master is what gave us Indian music in the West.
Yeah, and the presentation of it, in the book, you discuss how that when you go to see an Indian classical concert nowadays, it will start with a slow section, 25 minutes of rubato improvisation. It'll then speed up, and then it'll get into some compositions, and then this frenzied kind of
ending,
climax. And I thought, you claim in the book that basically Ali Akbar Khan and Ravi Shankar kind of worked together and kind of created this new type of presentation.
Yeah. I mean, they knew that I mean, at that time in the 30s, when Ravi was doing his studies in the 40s, in the 30s, the way to hear Indian classical music was to go to a palace, and you would spend a whole evening. I mean, there's that book, that film by Satyajit Ray, The Music Room. Those people, they have food, they're sitting. It's all women aren't allowed. It's all the guys sitting around with a hookah or whatever. They got everything that everybody needs for a long stretch, and they'll hear an alap that will go on forever, and then they'll hear a different raga, depending whether it goes from the afternoon to the evening. It isn't, and Ravi and Ali Akbar Khan knew when they went to the West that you couldn't go to New York and book town hall for an 8-hour session. Nobody would come. So they compressed it all into these 2-hour concerts. And eventually they started doing these 2-hour concerts back in Delhi, and all the Indian, and middle class Indians went, oh, that's great. We can dig that. We can relate to that. And so that's now very much the way that Indian music is performed. But I just came from India. I was invited to the Jaipur Literary Festival.
Nice.
And it was fantastic. I mean, it's so inspiring. People there, there's so many young people, teenagers, 20-somethings, 30-somethings, gagging there's 5 stages, 5 days. From 9 in the morning, they have music for an hour. And then from then on, it's just sessions, 50-minute long sessions. And these young people taking notes, asking questions, buying books, so eager, so committed, so wanting to know, soak up knowledge.
Wow.
And you just wonder, would that happen here? I just finished reading that Harper magazine article about people teaching English literature at Ivy League colleges who discovered their students never read a book from beginning to end and are absolutely horrified at the reading list and come to complain and leave the course because they refuse to read 10 novels in the course of a 3-month semester. And these Indians are just like, give me a book. I want to read it. Whatever it is, I'm going to read. I'm just soaking it all up. So that was kind of inspiring. But again, in the morning, they had classical recitals. And we didn't always make it to every one, but the ones we did, there was like a slow piece, and then they would finish. And then they would do something else that was a different rhythm. But there wasn't this. I think once I saw this progression from slow to middle, to medium to fast, but mostly they were considered like separate pieces of different tempi. And one
Interesting.
one of my favorite moments that I in this making this talking what we're talking about now, these connections that go, and you look at one level, there's a rhythmic connection through the Grateful Dead, through Shakti, through John McLaughlin, through all of this, Mickey Hart, and there's melodic and improvisational connections through Coltrane, through all of this. But when you look for the really ancient connections that go through this migration of Roma people to the West, and you think of it in terms of Balkan music and things like that. But I remember watching a video from Spanish television of a great flamenco singer. And I had learned that flamenco has these 12 and 16 bar rhythmic patterns that repeat. You may be able to actually write it down on a piece of music paper and divide it into 4-bar measures, but the cycles are actually 12 bar and 16 bar, just like Indian.
Mm.
And there was this singer who, as he sang, he would rap his knuckles on the table, and the people were clapping occasionally. It was a slower, but it was a medium tempo flamenco. And I've noticed that when he got to the end of a 12-bar sequence, he would go like that, which is exactly what an Indian classical singer does at the end of a 12 note 12 beat sequence. And and I said, okay, there we go. That's further proof. Further proof was needed.
Interesting. Yeah, I did some research because I thought, hey, is this guy overstating the case? So I called up Debashish Bhattacharya, who's a great slide guitarist, and was chatting with his brother who was about to get on stage. And, I said, hey, I didn't want to bias him. So I said, how did Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar Khan change how music is presented? And indeed, he said that, in earlier times, there were such things as open air concerts for the public in Maharaja times in Calcutta, but he said that would be more like they would do like dramas or something like that and sneak some raga in. And then he was telling me that Aladdin Khan gave a concert once, and his concert was like he played the sarod for a little while, and then he said, no, it doesn't sound good today. He'd pick up the sarangi, play for a while, and then he's like, no, I'm not feeling it, and finished with violin. So it was very varied the way it would be performed. And, indeed, he confirmed that he said that Ravi had kind of sometimes experimented, like, okay, in Europe, I'll try to do something fast at first before I go into if it's a rowdy crowd, and then go. But he said he saw Ali Akbar Khan 100 times, and he never varied in terms of course, the ragas, the music changed, but presentation, Alap, George, Allah, this kind of thing. And the other door I went down, inspired by your book, was I ended up reading a book on Annapurna Devi and asking people who are disciples of his disciple, her, And the amazing thing about her is that, so many of the greatest Indian classical musicians come from her. Hari Prasad Charazia, the greatest flute player.
Really? Yeah.
The greatest santur player. I just learned how to do alap, Shiv Kumar Shamra. And there is in that book, it's an official biography, so it's probably got its biases.
Well, I do feel a little remiss in that I didn't really talk up her brilliance as a musician on the Surbahar. I focus more on how bruised she was in her marriage to Ravi and all this kind of thing, and so she comes off as a bit of a victim, I suppose, or without. I didn't,
Yeah.
I'm trying to cram so much stuff into a small space. I
Oh,
didn't.
sure. Yeah. Well, it wasn't a criticism. It's just that
Yeah,
you
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
led me down a very interesting path and learning, and if she chose the path of being a renunciant, so
yeah,
you
yeah,
can't blame her for getting, she
yeah,
only recorded unintentionally. She would rip up if the
yeah,
tapes.
yeah.
So, we don't know what she sounded like except for a few
Right,
scratchy
right,
recordings. But it
right.
is a fascinating figure that in the shadows, and silently she
Just
passed along.
Yeah, just to say, just to identify for listeners, who she is. She's Aladdin Khan's daughter, who Ravi Shankar married, kind of loving the family, honored to be connected to the family. But he'd been all over, he'd lost his virginity to a French dancer when he was 14 or something. And he, at some point, told her about his adventures premarital, which completely freaked her out. And she had real trouble digesting all that information. And then, of course, the fact that he was a relentless flirt and probably unfaithful in the marriage, she was just, it was just horrific for her. She couldn't handle it at all. And, and so eventually they divorced, which it's great that I've seen some footage of Ravi arriving back at Aladdin Khan's house and being greeted by Ali Akbar and Aladdin Khan's wife and Ali Akbar Khan and Annapurna's mother, like a long lost son, and they embrace him and they put flowers on, and it's very sweet. And so he was forgiven,
Mm,
but she wasn't there. Annapurna did not welcome him.
yeah.
She was off doing whatever she was doing.
Yeah, and it's so what another incredible thing you did, and maybe it might have been influenced by the book you're talking about in the West, but almost forensically, you put together how eventually George Harrison and the Beatles got turned on to raga, piece
Yeah,
by piece, starting with George Avakian and someone named
yeah,
Dick Rock, and it goes person to person, I guess. Then,
yeah. Then to the Birds producer, what was his name?
well,
Anyway,
David Crosby's in a bathtub with
yeah, yeah, with with George and John, yeah, yeah.
an empty bathtub.
Zsa Zsa Gabor's Black Bathtub plays a key
Yeah.
role in the dissemination of Indian music in the West.
And they were all there was kind of like weed and psychedelics lubricating the path the whole way of,
Yeah,
you know, you have any,
and
yeah,
my favorite footnote to all of this is that George Harrison's mother, when she was pregnant with George, used to stay up late at night to listen to the Indian music broadcasts on the Armed Forces radio during the war, which they would do for the benefit of the Indian troops that were fighting for the British Army. They would have a little 1 a.m. or something slot where they play Indian music. And she couldn't sleep one night and she discovered it and loved it and used to stay up and tune it in and listen to the stuff while she's pregnant with George. So, hey,
yeah. And another thing I can confirm, or maybe I don't know how, if it was your own ears that taught you this, but I had interviewed Zakir Hussain, and he told a tale of how he told George Harrison he wanted to become a rock drummer, and George told him, "Look, you should stay with tabla because I'm studying sitar, but like, I'm not going to accomplish much on the sitar, but I can take what I learned from the sitar and apply it to the guitar, and it'll make me a better guitarist." And
yeah.
that's something I don't know how you came across. Was that from interviews, or that was your own ear? How
Well,
it was?
a bit of both. I mean, I think I did read that on Lake Dal in Kashmir when George and Patty were with Ravi and his girlfriend in those houseboats, and he was practicing earnestly. And this was the first time he'd had the piece from Beatlemania had kind of tuned out, and he was there in the middle of this beautiful, Himalayan valley, and And he really focused. He ate vegetarian food, and he meditated every day, and he was Ravi was there to give him lessons every day. And after a while, he went, "Wait a minute, what am I doing? I'll never parachute into this culture and create beauty on this instrument. It's just too late. I mean, I'm not Indian. I'm not." But as he said, I'm very pleased. I hadn't found that quote that you just mentioned. But you can hear, if you listen to George's playing, you can hear that it changed. He was always a really good guitar player, but he became a much more interesting guitar player and songwriter after his exposure to Ravi and his deep dive into Indian music, which he loved.
Yeah, and there's a quote that David Byrne read about, what's the last song on Revolver? Turn off your mind to relax and float downstream.
Yeah.
That was the most revolutionary moment in all of pop culture and music. That through the music, a different, something different was being stated. We're not in the Brill Building songs anymore.
Exactly. And Revolver, I mean, that record was such an impact. Time out 1 second. Okay. Sorry. It's my last day here, so I'm trying to get to the bottom of this pile of gems.
Oh, good. I'm actually not familiar with that label. What kind of label?
Yazoo Records was wonderful reissue of blues.
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay.
Label during the 80s, 90s, 70s, 80s. And but now I'm burning now a double album by the John Kirby Sextet. Are you familiar with them? They were sort of a jazz revolution. I love jazz revolutions or revolutions in any kind of music that never went anywhere, that were completely revolutionary but uninfluential. And John Kirby was a wonderful bass player, and he had a great band in the 30s, sort of late 30s. And they were taking jazz. They played jazz arrangements of classical, like Grieg and Ravel and stuff like that, but with a beat, danceable, and wonderful arrangements, and but along came bebop and blew it out of the water. But it's like a siding going off the track of jazz down another route. Oops, right, dead end.
Yeah, kind of some evolutionary.
But it's beautiful music anyway. John Kirby Sextet. You should.
Yeah, I'll check it out. That sounds really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess we don't have to dwell too much more on the Indian thing, but it starts spreading, right? I mean, did you have any theories why Indian music and rock, the consciousness movements, the psychedelics, all that stuff, kind of why it all happened at once, why that was a match for the audience?
Well, I think Indian music but there's lots of reasons and lots of theories. I wouldn't say any of them are definitive. I wouldn't want to say that I know I can't nail an answer to that question exactly, but I think, my exposure, for example, to the Incredible String Band, these two guys from Edinburgh, they were questing. They meditated, they took acid, they tried this, they tried that. Indian music was a perfect soundtrack for that. As David Crosby discovered, he took the test pressing home and lit up a joint. It was like, wow. And then he got a girl in bed and put on the Indian record, and wow, the combination of everything together was fantastic. And And I think it was, and you know, as I think, you know, there's that Nick Nick Kent piece, "A Revolution in Your Head." He wrote that review of Revolver, and he said that this music contravenes everything about Western culture. It kind of it's the antimatter of Western culture. And I think the people who were looking to tune in, turn on, drop out in the 60s were looking for something that was antimatter to Western culture. And you know, and John Coltrane was ahead of everybody, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And he had discovered, oh my gosh, the tempered Western scale is not absolute. Most of the world doesn't even know what it is. I read somewhere there was a thing I read, and it was really drove me crazy. I could never find it again to quote it in my book, but it was somehow a story of like a ethnomusicologist who goes into an African village that is very isolated. It's never had a white man there with a microphone or whatever, and he had a tape recorder, and he had some tapes of Western music. I don't know what kind. I can't remember the story, but it was like Western music. And he played some for the kids in the village. And they went and ran away because it sounded so dissonant. And, you know, our ears are so accustomed because, you know, the tempered scale is actually very, very wrong. I mean, it's very fudged. It's like if you start a scale on E and you go da 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 dum, there's a mathematical basis for all those intervals that will sound right. You go down one note to D, you go da 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 da. There's a mathematical basis for those, but the third note in the D scale and the second note in the E scale are almost the same, but they're not the same. They're actually different mathematically in order to be correct. And so in making a piano, the well-tempered clavier means that they took what that note is supposed to sound like in each of the scales of all the notes, starting with C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G. Whatever that note is in each one of these scales, whatever it's supposed to sound like, it's all approximately around the same place, but not exactly the same place. And so they took an average of those. So it's not actually correct, absolutely nailed correct for any scale. It's just sort of correct. And our ears have just become used to it. We hear a clustered chord on the piano or a chord on a guitar with frets, and it sounds fine, but it's a little wrong. Whereas in Indian music, you have this, you move the little ridges, the little arcs that on the strings, you squeeze them up and down so that they're tuned exactly to the scale of the rag. And one of my favorite characters that I discovered in this research for the book, of course, was Pandit Pramnath, who was the darling, the guru for Lamont Young and Terry Riley, who thought he was the most amazing musician. Have you ever listened to Pandit Pramnath?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at first, like for example, I played some of it to my wife Andrea, who loves, you know, she's a huge music fan, and her first response was, "Whoa, this is heavy. This is kind of heavyweight stuff that I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to listen to this." Now, she's completely addicted, and we love Pandit Pramnath, and so because what he does is he he knows like 400 rocks, and every single one of them starts at a microscopically different point in the on the musical scale, which is just out there. There are no keys, there are no frets. It's just open, from here to there. And they're all microscopically different, and you can hear him hit these intervals, which you will never hear on a piano. And it's just like, whoa, listen to this guy. He just has such incredible pitch and control. And anyway, that was fun writing about him.
Yeah, and that might be the key. I mean, there's a mathematical perfection, and the tempura, creating the drone, sets one up to be perfectly in tune, because it's creating that third note that we fudge in the West.
Yeah.
Just gets created with the overtones, and it's sung to.
And if we want to segue to another side, Slavic village music, people sing in harmony based on overtones. One voice, and the woman next to the singer who's starting picks up on an overtone of her voice and sings that note, and then the next person picks up on the overtones created by the two voices and sings that note. It's just a whole different way of thinking about music than we do in the West.
Yeah, and it hits you hard, and it hit Terry Riley hard, and Lamont Young very, very hard, in their life. And then, if we're talking about how this music influenced the greater Western culture, it's a pretty direct line from Terry Riley and Lamont Young to Brian Eno, and then we're into everything,
Right. Yeah.
it's everything you've ever,
Yeah. And of course, it goes the same way backwards. Like as you say, look at Fela Kuti and Tony Allen, who were so influenced by, Tony Allen by Max Roach, Fela Kuti by James Brown. The circles go both ways.
Yeah. I mean, that's. I mean, there's so much to talk about that with the Congolese rumba. And that was another mystery that you solved for me, because I had studied with some griot musicians for a while, and sometimes they would show me a piece, and it would be like a straight Latin montuno, and I'd get so confused, which chicken or egg situation, and of course it's both. But in the book, you really explain how those vinyl records made it to Africa.
Yeah.
And that someone, and it was the best Cuban music, made it. It was like Trio Matamoros and stuff like that. So had that happen, had that create this kind of golden age of African music, or is that too big a question for you?
Well, I mean, no, it's a wonderful story that some clever guy in London, in the office of HMV Records, said, "Hey, let's license Columbia's and Victor's and Odeon's catalog of Cuban music, press them onto shellac, ship them to Africa." And particularly when they got to Kinshasa or Leopoldville, as it was then, the Congolese were like, wow, we know this music. And of course they know that music because it came to Cuba from the Congo and from that area, from that part of the African coast. And now it was coming back. And the best thing was that in that form in which it came back, and this is one of the interesting things about technology at a certain time and how it worked, it sounded modern. And that's one of the things that I loved about the patterns that I discovered as I was reading and researching on this, that somehow this collision of African music and African culture with European culture in the Americas defined modernity, came to define modernity. That, you know, in the 20s, like, you weren't modern if you weren't jazzing. You know, if your music wasn't influenced by jazz, which meant New Orleans at that time, which meant this mixture, you weren't modern. You know, you were square, you were old fashioned. And even back into the 19th century, you know, modernity was defined by music that was like Liszt was a modern guy. He was a first big star. And he was totally basing his whole stage persona and his virtuosity on Janos Bihari, who was a Roma fiddler, you know, and and so, and then when it comes full circle and came back to the Congo, you know, they recognized that this music, if they played it, it would be a way, as somebody says in the book, somebody makes the comment that Bob Marley showed the Africans how it's possible to be both African and modern. But I think even before Bob Marley showed them that, Trio Matamoros and those other Cuban bands showed people in Congo how it was possible to be both African and modern. Because, of course, the colonial propaganda was, you're primitive, you're backward, you're undeveloped, you know. And so to be able to say, not only can we take our music, our songs, our scales, our attitudes, whatever, and just put a little Cuban tortilla underneath it and put our stuff on top, and it becomes modern. There's that book that I cite called Noise Uprising, which says that those recordings that were made by African countries in the 50s, African artists across Africa in the late 40s, starting the late 40s through the 50s and into the independence era of the 60s, gave these African cultures the confidence to throw off colonialism, because they felt that their music sounded like James Brown. I mean, it was as good. It sounded as hot. It was as hot to dance to as James Brown, who was American, which is the definition of what's international and powerful and modern. And it transformed the mentality of people who had been demoralized by colonialism.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that makes me think of a group that I got hip to from reading your book was the Manhattans in South Africa, who are like as good as any jazz vocal group ever, and they're wearing, they're dressed to the nines in an American style. It also makes me think, when you say modernity being African, I hadn't really thought about that, but Picasso's African masks.
Yeah.
It's all
that's it. The only way to become modern, the 19th and the 20th century has pretty much showed, was to get more African. And there's a wonderful book by a Columbia professor. I don't know if you've ever come across Ann Douglas.
No.
I'm not sure what subject she teaches, or whether she's
in the English department. I just haven't met her, but
yeah. She wrote a book called Terrible Honesty, Mongrel Manhattan in the 1920s. And it's a fantastic book. It's just one of my favorite books of all time. And her point in the book is, in the 1920s, in New York, there was a confluence of forces. Freudianism, Madison Avenue, skyscrapers, post-war, whatever, celebration to get out of the trenches, and black music. And those five forces came together in the 20s to create our modern world, our modern culture. It all started there, and black music was at the heart of it. And she talks about, she has these wonderful incredible passages of quotes from letters between Ernest Hemingway and his mother. His mother was a Christian Scientist, who said, the Christian Science idea, if you say it's perfect, it will be perfect.
Mm.
And Hemingway had been driving an ambulance in World War One and had been loading body parts onto a stretcher. And there was no way to make that perfect. And so he started writing very realistic prose while he was working in Chicago and hanging out on the South Side with black people, black African Americans, and listening to black jazz. And when his mother wrote saying, "Why, Ernest, please, why do you want us to rub our noses in ugliness and sorrow and blood and and he said, come on, Mom, I'm now telling it like it is, and he got that whole attitude from a combination of his traumatic experiences in the war and African American culture.
Wow. So before we don't have all the time in the world. So there's some questions I'm like, if I talk to Joe Boyd, I have to ask. First one is, in the book, you talk about a time that you were with Muddy Waters and Sister Rosetta Tharpe, listening to, I think it was Django Reinhardt's brother.
Joseph Reinhardt. Yeah.
Well, one, I mean, it's an amazing story, but how open-eared was Muddy Waters? Was he like digging music?
Oh, yeah, they all loved it. I mean, Rosetta claimed to have, loved Django, or I think she'd been to France, and that's a fascinating. One of my favorite quotes in the book is the one from B.B. King, where he discovered Django just kind of by accident, and it changed his approach to the guitar. And I think Sister Rosetta had she's very those melodic improvisations are kind of, I don't know, maybe she did. She loved presenting herself as a sophisticate who knew France and spoke a bit of French. But they all loved being there. They loved the scene. They loved the beer, the hot dogs, and the music, and the waitress was singing like with a voice like Piaf, and no, it was a great moment.
So Muddy was like, from stuff I've read, I mean, he was kind of, his interests were probably pretty like wide open in general.
Yeah, I mean, he was a great guy. He was quiet, but not shy. He was quiet. He had a kind of totemic dignity to him on the bus. He didn't talk as much as everybody else, but when he did, everybody listened. Otis Spann talked all the time. He loved it. Otis was, the one he was, and Cousin Joe and Ransom Knowling were the sort of sophisticates on the bus, who would read the New York Herald Tribune, International Herald Tribune with me every morning and demand that everybody in the bus discuss current events.
Wow. So that was your start, right? I mean, that was through George Wein. You're taking. I actually worked for George too earlier in my career.
Everybody worked for George. God bless him.
He was the greatest. And speaking of working for George, this is one thing I've always wanted to get straight. You were present when the crowd started to boo when Dylan got on stage, and some people say it was because of sound quality, and other people say it was because he was turning his back on the entire socialist movement. What was your take? Why?
My take was I thought they got it pretty well in the film. I think in retrospect, I was excited. I liked what he was doing, and I was sort of against I loved Pete Seeger, but I was not very fond of Lomax or Theo Bickel. And when the first chords of Maggie's Farm hit, people did start to boo. Some people booed, some people cheered. And at the end of the three numbers, there's this noise. And I don't know if you remember, the New York Yankees had a first baseman called Bill Skowron, who was nicknamed Moose. And whenever he came up, everybody go, Moose, Moose. And it sounded like they were booing him, but they weren't. They were saying Moose. And the crowd there was saying more, 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 or boo, boo, boo. And the long vowel sounds pretty much the same. But I think in retrospect, it was, this was a very precious thing, the Newport Folk Festival. And yes, Pete Seeger has said later on, he said, I wasn't really against what Bob was doing. We'd had drums before on stage with Howling Wolf and the Tennessee Three with Johnny Cash. There had been drums and electric instruments on stage before. But I think I've had plenty of time in the last couple of years being interviewed a lot about it to analyze what was actually going on there. And I feel the sound was pretty good. Paul Rothschild was mixing it, and he was a great producer. He would have, he balanced it well. But in the film, The Complete Unknown, there were two anachronisms that I spotted. One anachronism was the zebra crossings on the streets. Those didn't exist in the 60s. They were a complete invention of the 70s. But the other one was a stage monitor at Newport when Dylan was playing. There was a little monitor. You could see it just in front of the vocal mic. There were no stage monitors. They didn't exist in 1965. Nobody did that. Nobody heard themselves back when they sang or heard their guitar or whatever. So basically, and I think we had some mics on the drums, and we had a mic for the vocal, for Dylan's vocal, and I think we had mics in front of the amps, but Bloomfield was amped. He was charged up. He was ready for this moment, and he cranked it up. He was loud.
Mm.
And Rothschild had to balance the sound against Mike. If Mike was going to be twice as loud as Dylan's voice, it would have sounded terrible. So Dylan's voice and the other instruments and the drums, had to come up to fit in with Bloomfield's guitar, which was screaming. So it was probably the loudest thing that anybody had ever heard. And I think for people who aren't used to that, it could sound pretty horrible, until your ears get used to it. I remember thinking it sounded great. I don't remember I don't think it was distorted. It was distorted because the amps were putting out a bit of a distorted sound because they were cranked up. But, but it was for sure, in retrospect, an invasion of careerist, top 40, Tin Pan Alley, Brill Building, major label, promotion into this beautiful little, exquisite, precious little acoustic thing of the Newport Folk Festival. And it kind of destroyed it. And within a year, all the folk clubs had become rock clubs and all the jazz clubs had become rock clubs. And it changed everything. And, not necessarily for the better, but maybe, who knows? I mean, that's life. Things happen and culture changes. But that's my take on that night.
Mm. And he was their messiah too. So it wasn't just.
Yeah. Right? A lot of people felt betrayed.
Yeah.
And people who really believed in what the Newport Folk Festival was all about, which was everybody got $25 a day, free room and board. There were Dylan didn't get paid any more than Roscoe Holcomb. And it was you know, acoustic music and gentle in a way. And Dylan was not gentle, you know, it was nothing lyrical or gentle about that night, but you know, but it was a moment in history, and that was kind of historical forces, tectonic plates crunching up against each other.
And it felt like that in the moment. It felt
It
like
absolutely felt like that. People knew all weekend. It was tense. Everybody said, "What's he going to do?"
wow. All right, another person. If I asked about Muddy Waters, I have to ask about Albert Einstein.
All I can, yeah, I trick or treated. My brother, who's right behind me, can vouch for that. We trick or treated the Einsteins, and he gave us candy corn, as I recall. And he was a figure around Princeton. You'd see him around Princeton. My mother ran the camera department at the university store, and he used to come in and buy his film. And Oppenheimer bought his film, and the great mathematician Wigner bought his film. You know, it was the Institute for Advanced Studies just down the road. We used to walk the dog there.
And did you have as a kid? Did you have did you feel like, oh, this guy has a vibe? This is a special person, or was he just?
Oh well, yeah. He was revered in the town. Everybody knew. You know, Einstein was already Einstein by that time. You know.
Well, man, I could talk to you forever, but appreciate the time. This was great. We will promote and be seeing you because my wife and I are up in Woodstock, so we'll be checking you out at Saugerties.
Okay, great.
And I guess you're doing the movie and the
movie Monday night, and then the thing at the local.
Yeah. So we'll be there, and we'll make sure to promote your Brooklyn event as well coming up.
Yeah, cool. Okay, great.
This was great. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.